QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Internal or external reports? Let's get into it with Intuit's QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Here we are in our Get Great Guitars practice file. We currently have the open windows open. You can open the open windows by going to the view dropdown, selecting the open windows list. We're now thinking about which types of reports we would want to group together for external reporting, what types of reports we might be saving or want to customize for internal reporting. How can we sort those two types of reports? Now, obviously, the reports that we provide externally will depend on who we're giving the reports to. We might be giving them to a client or a customer. We might be a bookkeeper that's providing them to a client or customer, or we might be providing them to a supervisor or possibly to tax preparers at the year end for tax and or audit or review type of work. So the needs will then drive what kind of reports we want to put together. But whatever we're putting together, we know that we need to give some of the basic kind of reports, which of course would typically include the financial reports, balance sheet, and income statement reports. Then we have all these other reports that we've been taking a look at. And the question would then be, do we need to be including these other reports as we group them together and provide them to whoever we're going to provide them to? Or are these going to be reports that we should keep on an internal basis? Now, as we've done this, we've been putting this information together into an Excel worksheet and saving our data for the financial statement reports, as we've done here in section 5, and we've been putting all the other reports into this one Excel worksheet so that we can then print that Excel worksheet in the format of a PDF and then have all our files on that one PDF type of file. So that's what we would like to do. We would like to provide our information to someone as efficiently as possible. But then the question is, well, which reports out of all these other reports, these supplemental reports, reports that are added on to the financial statement that are providing more detail related to line items on the financials, balance sheet, and income statement, which ones should we be saving? Which ones should we be providing? And which ones might we need, but only for our internal use? So we'll recap the reports that we looked at in the latest section and kind of give a discussion on them and export the ones that we think are going to be most applicable. So notice we have set up in the memorized reports category. I've categorized our memorized reports. If we go to the reports dropdown and the reports center, we might, and I maximize this, and if we go into our memorized area, this is one way you might think about your reports. You might think about reports in terms of how I'm going to group them together for month-end needs. For example, month-end needs that I'm going to give to a client or a supervisor or possibly the CPA firm if they're helping with adjusting entries. And then we have the year-end needs. So we might have year-end needs that we're going to provide this information for the end of the year, which may differ because we have tax preparation information and whatnot to our CPA firm or to our customer or our clients in that regard, or to our supervisor. And then these reports that we might be using internally, maybe I don't provide them to these individuals, but rather I want to customize them so that they have the easiest use for my internal usage. So let's go through some of these reports we've taken a look at. On the accounts receivable side of things, if I go to the reports dropdown, customers and receivables, we took a look at an AR aging summary report. Let's open that one back up. And I'm going to change the date to 02/28/21. Now this one is going to give us detail basically on the accounts receivable aging, a line item on the income statement, and it's breaking that information out as to how old or how past due this information is. Now the question here, do we want to provide this to a client? Usually, possibly not, right? They might not want to see the accounts receivable aging. If you're telling them here's my monthly bookkeeping information that I put together, you might not need this information to include unless it's something that's going to be applicable to them. If you provide it to a supervisor, might be necessary, possibly not necessary for year-end tax information unless they're digging into it deeper information for it. But we might want it. So this one I would think maybe for internal use. So you still might customize this one and then save it basically for internal use. That's what I'll do here. I'll say, okay, let's do our standard customization, removing the items over here. And I'm going to go customize, and I'll say that we want to filter this or go to the header and footer. I'm going to remove the date and the time and put the name in the footer. And then we'll go to the fonts and numbers. I'm going to say that we want parentheses around the negatives, red, and maybe we can remove the pennies. You might want the pennies in there for a report like this, but this is a summary report. So maybe I remove the pennies. And so it looks a little bit cleaner. And then maybe I want it formatted like this for my internal use. So I might save it. I might memorize this and say this is for the internal use. And I'm going to save that into my internal use. I'm not going to give it to my external reports if I'm thinking of myself as a bookkeeper providing that information. I'll just use it internally. And then every time I go into it, I can just simply go to the reports drop down and then the memorized reports and go to my internal use, and it'll be formatted for me already. So that's the first one. We also did an accounts payable report, which would be similar. So if I went to the reports drop down, if we went to the vendors and payable aging summary, similar kind of report on the payable side. So 022821. We don't have much activity in ours. You might have a whole lot of payables that you're going into. So it depends on what you're doing. Once again, it might not be applicable to a client if you're a bookkeeping client, unless they have particular needs to the payable. If you work in accounts payable, then this would be the report you work with all the time for the supervisor. But I might use this for internal use. So I'll do the same thing here. I'm going to customize this report, and I'm going to assign it to internal use. I'm going to remove the date prepared, time prepared, and then put our name in the footer. And then I'll go into the fonts and numbers, and I'm going to make parentheses around negative numbers, make them red, and remove the cents. And I'm going to save it, and then I'll just declare this one an internal report. So I'm going to go to memorize. I'm going to say internal use, and then I'll put it into our internal use folder. So internal reports. So now if I go to my reports down here, it'll be there. If I go to the drop down and I go to memorize reports, now I just go right here to my major internal reports, and they'll all be in my drop down, and they'll already be formatted the way I like to see them for internal use, not for reporting purposes to other use. And then I'm going to close this back out. We also had a sales by customer report and then a sales by item report. So those were looking like this. If I went to the reports drop down, we went to the sales by customer summary. So we might have this information. And then I can break this out between 010121 to 022821. Now this, again, it could be something that you might want as a bookkeeper to provide to somebody else to support who the client is making sales to, or to a supervisor. But it's not something that's essential, right? This is usually something that someone would ask for. We probably might not group it every time into the data. So I'm going to assume this is once again like an internal type report. And we did include this information, which might be applicable in graph format to make our report a little bit more, have a graph in there. Maybe we don't want the data in this format. Maybe we want a graph, and we'll show the graph. And if that intrigues them, our client, then we can give them the more supporting data, which would be this report to support what the graph, how we built the graph. So I'm going to assume this is internal, same type of thing. I'm going to go to customize. I'm going to say that we're going to go to the header and footer, date, time, and report basis. We'll put our name in the footer. And then I'm going to go to the fonts and numbers, parentheses around negative number, remove the pennies. And then I'm going to say OK. And I'm going to save this in the internal reports, memorize, save, and I'm going to put it in the internal reports. OK. So this one, if I go to the reports drop down and go to the memorized reports, then we have this one in here as well. And I didn't say IU in it, but in any case, there it is. Then I'm going to close that one out. We also have the sales by item, similar report drop down, sales item, sales by item summary. This is what we actually sell, changing the dates up top from 010121, 022821. This, again, useful report. We made a graph based on this report. Maybe we're going to provide that to the client. So we might not need this added report. Maybe I wouldn't generally put this into like what I'm going to group as I put together the package of bookkeeping on a monthly basis or whatever to the client. So maybe I'll say, but I would use this internally. So maybe I'll save this again as an internal report, going to the customize, and then I'll say I want to go to the header and footer, date, time, report basis, fonts and numbers, and then I'm going to parentheses, red, remove the pennies, and then there it is. And then we'll memorize this report. And I'm going to put internal use, and then we'll save that in the internal use, and OK. Closing that one out. We have the inventory reports. So if I go to reports drop down, we looked at inventory. So inventory, the most common report probably being the inventory valuation summary. We'll probably use that one a lot. But again, it's probably an internal report more. I mean, I probably don't provide this. I may not provide it on the monthly batching to a customer unless they want the more detail related to it. So I'm going to say this is 022821. There's our inventory report. I'll customize the report, fonts and numbers, or header and footer, remove the time basis, put our name in the footer, and then fonts and numbers. Maybe I want the pennies on this one because I might have the cost there. So I'll just do parentheses and red numbers, and I'll keep the pennies on this one and say, okay, memorize this report. I'm going to call this an internal report. So internal report, and I'll just label it internal use report, and okay. So we had the inventory report, and then we had all the employee earnings reports, which again, I won't go into those in detail because inventory is kind of a specialty area, but you may not have all the detailed reports for employees or wages as you compile the monthly data, because it would overwhelm a normal client, you know. So if you're doing payroll, you might have your own separate email of all the payroll information if they want that information packaged separately, possibly than the other bookkeeping, if you add all the detail related to it. Then we have the bank reconciliation. That's going to be a report that you want to print as you go each time that you print it. Once again, it's probably an internal report. We're not going to save the settings on it because the format of it will be a little bit different. Then we had the transaction list by date report, which is a report that we might provide to the client if we're using it on a basis of billing. So meaning, if I go to the reports dropdown and I go to accounting and taxes, we have the transaction list by date report. Now, and changing the dates from 01/01/21 to 02/28/21. Now, we might use this report to bill with. We might say, hey, look, this is the 2-month time period. I entered all these transactions, and I'm going to bill you basically on the number of transactions. Like if you're within a range of transactions, I'll bill you on that. And then maybe you provide this as basically evidence of that process. So you might customize this report for, external use if that were the case. Otherwise, it would be internal. So I might customize it, and we'll say that I want to go to the header and footer, and I'll go to remove the date and the time, and then I'll go to the fonts and numbers. Now, if I'm going to provide it externally, then I might go parentheses, red, and then remove the pennies for external use. So we have something like that. You could even remove some of the columns if you so choose, basically for external use. For internal use, I probably would want the pennies so that I can see the entire transaction. So I might save it a little differently for internal and external purposes. So I might say customize. I might say then I'm going to memorize this for external use. And then I'm going to save as, and I'm going to put it into the month end or year end. So this would probably be the month end billing. So we might put it into both month end and year end. So let's call it month end, and then I'm going to say save, and then I might save it in year end as well with a new report, year end. And then I might save it as in my reports as well and change it a little bit. So I might say, I want the pennies for my internal use. So I'm going to say I would like the pennies for my internal use, and then save it for my internal use a little bit differently. I'll say new, and this will be for the internal use, and I'll put this into our internal report. So that's one way you might sort it out. So there we have that. Now this one, if I'm going to use it for billing, I'll export it. So I'll export it to the Excel so I can put it in my PDF file and save it along with all the other reports. So I'm going to say, let's go ahead and put this in my Excel worksheet and or print it as a PDF. So I'm just going to export it here. I'm going to go to the existing workbook, and I'm going to export it to this workbook along with all the other ones we have been creating in the practice problem, and simply export. So there it is. I'm going to pull this to the right, and you might want to save these in a different order in Excel. So I'm just kind of doing them as we go here. I'm going to double click. This is the transaction detail report, and then I'm going to do the normal formatting. If I go to the second tab here and say OK, we have our title up top. We might want to change the title to something like, this is our billing, this is the number of transactions that we're billing on or something, and even put the rate on the top or something like that. And then it would say we'd have view. I'm going to go to the Windows split, remove the splits, go back to the first tab or the first view, and then we can adjust it so that it fits on one page. Here's where the page break will be. I'm going to go to the page layout and go to the orientation and landscape orientation. And then I don't need this first column really, so I'm going to delete all the way to column C, right click and delete. And then you could delete all the inter columns. B, holding down Control, D, F, H, J, L, M, P. And then I'm letting go of Control, right clicking on the selected area and delete. So that looks pretty good. Now if I was to print this, if I go to using my Qt PDF printer on one PDF file, let's do one more thing. I'm going to go to the front of this report, and I have all these things that this is the thing that prints out whenever I have a new Excel sheet. I'm going to delete it. And then if I wanted to print all this out on one report, I can say let's print it. And then I want to print the entire thing using the Qt PDF printer, and I can print it all out on one report now. And notice it's still getting extensive. I have the summary balance sheet, and then I could have the detailed balance sheet. And again, even just the financials, you can have a whole bunch of different financials that you can have with comparison of multiple periods and whatnot. And then this is the end of the balance sheet. This is the comparative balance sheet that we could include or choose to include if we so choose. Income statement now, and then the vertical analysis income statement. Now we're at our pie charts that we've been including. You could decide which pie charts you want to include, format them better than this, obviously. But this is just a demonstration file. And then we finally have our transaction list. So here's our transaction list by date report. So there, I'm going to go back here, and then I'm going to close this out. Let's close this out and say yes. Save it this time. I'm not sure I saved the last expense report, so I'll save it this time. And then the next one was the journal report. This is another one we might actually bill with it. You could use it to show the work that you've done to a supervisor or to a client. Reports, it would be under the accounting and taxes, and then you have the journal report, and this would be the same date range 01/01/21 to 02/28/21. And this breaks out all your transaction. It gives you a little bit more detail because it's breaking out the debits and credits or all the accounts that are affected. So you can use this for a billing system as well. If you were to do that, then I would export this instead of the transaction detail report and possibly use this to like show the work that has been done for it. If not, it would be an internal report. Maybe you would save it internally. Now, some of these I might not need. Like if I'm saving them internally and I like to have the decimals and I'm not going to provide them to anybody else, then maybe I don't need to save it at all because I'm not making any significant changes internally to it. And if I know where it is, this one's a little bit buried. It's under reports, accounting and taxes, and the GL. If I'm with the journal, if I know where it is and I don't want to just move it up to an easier place to find up here, then maybe I'll just save it where it's at. If it's one I'm going to use a lot and I like to format it differently, then maybe it's worthwhile to change it, memorize it to whatever format that you're going to be using it for it internally. Otherwise, maybe I don't want to crowd too much of my internal usage folder and just use this, where it's at. I don't need to move it if I'm not going to change it. So, just a couple things to think about on that. And then we had our budget reports. Now, if you're making the budget, then you'd want to do your budget reports as well, because you'd want to show your budget reports that you're putting together. Many times you won't be doing the budget report within QuickBooks, possibly. Depends on what your client needs are. But if you're just doing the accounting, you might not have the budget reports that you would be generating. So we'll talk more about the budgeting at the end of this. So that's going to be, just a kind of a recap that of the reports that we've gone over lately, or the last few. Now, if you went into your financial statements now, into we can now save this to a PDF, one PDF file with all our documents. So I'm going to go ahead and print it. And I'm going to say this is going to a PDF. I'm going to do the entire workbook. And then I'm going to print it to the PDF, and then we'll just take a look at what we have. A lot of these could be cleaned up in terms of, especially the graphs, make them look nicer. But we'll get an idea of where we stand. I'm going to overwrite the financial statement we had last time, and then minimize this. And then this is what we have thus far in one PDF file that we can basically attach. And you can imagine providing this to a client or supervisor or someone. You would obviously need the balance sheet. You might just give the standard balance sheet, but you might want to start off with the summary balance sheet because it's easier to see. And then you might want to have the balance sheet, the standard balance sheet underneath it, because that gives the more detail for it. Or, you might, if you just want to keep it simple and not overwhelm someone, you might just have the summary balance sheet and use this balance sheet for your internal use, because this would be good for internal use. You also might want to have the income statement right after the balance sheet in order, and then have more detailed balance sheets after that. So you might have the summary balance sheet, and then the income statement, and then the more detailed balance sheet, just in the ordering process. So here's the end of the balance sheet, and then we have the comparative balance sheet. Now, when you think about the comparisons of the balance sheets, if it's been 2 months, you can compare month to month, and you can have your change column and your percent change. If it's been a full quarter, then you could have, a comparative last month to this month. You can have a quarter-to-quarter comparison. You can have a comparison of this year to last year. And you can have all 3 months that are going to be reported that'll show one at a time without the comparison. So there's a whole lot of reports. Now, you may not need as much of those changes and these different comparative reports when you're talking about the balance sheet. And obviously, you can have a year-over-year comparison compared to the last year in the same time period. You might not need all that with the balance sheet. It might be more relevant to do all these comparative reports with the income statement, because that's the performance report. But you have a lot of options once you have a couple of years of data in the system every month. You can do different comparisons. So then we have this comparative balance sheet. We have the income statement, and then once again, the income statement, we renamed it. You can call it the profit and loss or income statement. And then we have the comparative income statement. Then once again, the comparative income statement, you can have a whole lot of comparisons. This one we're comparing last month to this month, the change, the percent change. You can compare, this month to last year this month, the year to date compared to last year's year to date. You can have the quarter. If it was a quarter ended, you can have the quarter reports included in there as well. You can have the income for every month in the year, from the year to date by month in there. So there's a whole lot of different comparisons you can have on the income statement. It just depends on what you think would be best for your clients and how you think it would settle out the best. A lot of times, you can overwhelm the client with data, but you also want to make it, put enough information that you're showing that you can, you're putting the stuff together. So then we have the vertical analysis statement. So this is the one where we have the percentages on a vertical kind of analysis, comparing everything to sales. So another format that we can see the income statement in. Then we had our graphs. So we got the accounts receivable graph. So we didn't put the accounts receivable by, in this case, by customer here. We didn't line up the data, but we provided a graph for it. And then we also did it in Excel. So we showed the graph over here, but you could, remove the graph and just have the label of accounts receivable and show the graph data in this format. Or you can show it in a table format. This would be kind of up to you. And then that's the same graph, the sales by customer. Again, we didn't record the data for sales by customer, but maybe we want a graph. We'll just show that pictorially, and then they can see the sales by customer by graph, and they want more detail, they can show that. This is how we did it in Excel. So again, you could show the data, or you can basically make the pie chart all there is and remove the data in Excel so that you just have a graph, and that might be cleaner for the client to see. Here's another format of the same graph, and then another format of the graph. This is by item. So once again, this graph, you can make this graph larger. We wanted to show the data, and you can have a different graph down here. But you might want to remove the data and just show the graph, possibly, if you're showing it to a client. Just depends on how you're going to group everything together. And then the transaction list by date. Again, probably an internal report unless you're going to be using it kind of for billing, which could be a really transparent way to show the billing. You can say, hey, look, here's how many transactions we had. It falls into this range. We bill based on how many transactions. If you're in this range, this is basically how much we bill for. So that's one way that you can think through that information.